Hey everybody, this is a piece by Trotsky. It's titled Thermidor and Anti-Semitism. It's from February 1937. It was published in the New International in 1941, so after Trotsky died. I'm not sure, what was I going to say? I'm getting it from Marxist.org. So here we go. At the time of the last Moscow trial, I remarked in one of my statements that Stalin, in the struggle with the opposition, exploited the anti-Semitic tendencies in the country. On this subject, I received a series of letters and questions which were, by and large, there is no reason to hide the truth, very naive. Quote, how can one accuse the Soviet Union of anti-Semitism? End quote. If, quote, if the USSR is an anti-Semitic country, is there anything left at all? End quote. That was the dominant note of these letters. These people raise objections and are perplexed because they are accustomed to counterpose fascist anti-Semitism with the emancipation of the Jews accomplished by the October Revolution. To these people it now appears that I am wresting from their hands a magic charm. Such a method of reasoning is typical of those who are accustomed to vulgar, non-dialectical thinking. They live in a world of immutable abstractions. They recognize only that which suits them. The Germany of Hitler is the absolutist kingdom of anti-Semitism. The USSR, on the contrary, is the kingdom of national harmony. Vital contradictions, changes, transitions from one condition to another. In a word, the actual historical process escapes their lackadaisical attention. It has not yet been forgotten, I trust, that anti-Semitism was quite widespread in Tsarist Russia among the peasants, the petty bourgeoisie of the city, the intelligentsia, and the more backward strata of the working class. Quote, Mother Russia was renowned not only for her periodic Jewish pogroms, but also for the existence of a considerable number of anti-Semitic publications which, in that day, enjoyed a wide circulation. The October Revolution abolished the outlawed status of the Jews. That, however, does not at all mean that with one blow it swept out anti-Semitism. A long and persistent struggle against religion has failed to prevent suppliants even today from crowding thousands and thousands of churches, mosques, and synagogues. The same situation prevails in the sphere of national prejudices. Legislation alone does not change people. Their thoughts, emotions, outlook depend upon tradition, material conditions of life, cultural level, etc. The Soviet regime is not yet 20 years old. The older half of the population was educated under Tsarism. The younger half has inherited a great deal from the older. These general historical conditions in themselves should make any thinking person realize that, despite the model legislation of the October Revolution, it is impossible that national and chauvinist prejudices, particularly anti-Semitism, should not have persisted strongly among the backward layers of the population. But this is by no means all. The Soviet regime, in actuality, initiated a series of new phenomena which, because of the poverty and low cultural level of the population, were capable of generating anew, and did in fact generate anti-Semitic moods. The Jews are a typical city population. They comprise a considerable percentage of the city population in the Ukraine, in White Russia, and even in Great Russia. The Soviet, more than any other regime in the world, needs a very great number of civil servants. Civil servants are recruited from the more cultured city population. Naturally, the Jews occupied a disproportionately large place among the bureaucracy, and particularly so in the lower and middle levels. Of course, we can close our eyes to that fact and limit ourselves to vague generalities about the equality and brotherhood of all races. But an ostrich policy will not advance us a single step. The hatred of the peasants and the workers for the bureaucracy is a fundamental fact of Soviet life. The hatred of the peasants and the workers for the bureaucracy is a fundamental fact of Soviet life. The despotism of the regime, the persecution of every critic, the stifling of every living thought, finally, the judicial frame-ups are merely a reflection of this basic fact. Even by a priori reasoning, it is impossible not to conclude that the hatred of the bureaucracy would assume an anti-Semitic color. at least in those places where the Jewish functionaries compose a significant percentage of the population and are thrown into relief against a broad background of the peasant masses. In 1923, I proposed to the party conference of the Bolsheviks of the Ukraine that the functionaries should be able to speak and write in the idiom of the surrounding population. How many ironical remarks were made about this proposal, in the main by the Jewish intelligentsia who spoke and read Russian and did not wish to learn the Ukrainian language. It must be admitted that in that respect the situation has changed considerably for the better. But the national composition of the bureaucracy changed little, and what is immeasurably more important, the antagonism between the population and the bureaucracy has grown monstrously during the past 10 to 12 years. All serious and honest observers, especially those who have lived among the toiling masses for a long time, bear witness to the existence of anti-Semitism, not only of the old and hereditary, but also of the new, quote, Soviet, unquote, variety. The Soviet bureaucrat feels himself morally in a beleaguered camp. He attempts with all his strength to break through from his isolation. The politics of Stalin, at least to the extent of 50%, is dictated by this urge. To wit, 1. The pseudo-socialist demagogy, parenthesis, quote, socialism is already accomplished, end quote. Quote, Stalin gave, gives, and will give the people a happy life, end quote, etc., end parenthesis. 2. Political and economic measures designed to build around the bureaucracy a broad layer of a new aristocracy, parenthesis, the disproportionately high wages of the Stakhanovites, military ranks, honorary orders, the new, quote, nobility, end quote, etc., end parenthesis. 3. Catering to the national feelings and prejudices of the backward layers of the population. The Ukrainian bureaucrat, if he himself is an indigenous Ukrainian, will at the critical moment inevitably try to emphasize that he is a brother of the music and the peasant, not some sort of foreigner and under no circumstances a Jew. Of course, there is not, alas, exclamation point, a grain of, quote, socialism or even of elementary democracy in such an attitude, but that's precisely the nub of the question. The privileged bureaucracy, fearful of its privileges and consequently completely demoralized, represents at present the most anti-socialist and most anti-democratic stratum of Soviet society, In the struggle for its self-preservation, it exploits the most ingrained prejudices and most benighted instincts. If in Moscow, Stalin stages trials which accuse the Trotskyists of plotting to poison workers, then it is not difficult to imagine to what foul depths the bureaucracy can resort in some Ukrainian or Central Asiatic hovel! Exclamation point. He who attentively observes Soviet life, even if only through official publications, will from time to time see barred in various parts of the country hideous bureaucratic abscesses, bribery, corruption, embezzlement, murder of persons whose existence is embarrassing to the bureaucracy, violation of women, and the like. Were we to slash vertically through, we should see that every such abscess results from the bureaucratic stratum. Sometimes Moscow is constrained to resort to demonstration trials. In all such trials, the Jews inevitably comprise a significant percentage, in part because, as we already stated, they make up a great part of the bureaucracy and are branded with its idiom, partly because, impelled by the instinct for self-preservation, the leading cadre of the bureaucracy at the center, and in the provinces strives to divert the indignation of the working masses from itself to the Jews. This fact was known to every critical observer in the USSR as far back as 10 years ago, when the Stalin's regime had hardly as yet revealed its basic features. The struggle against the opposition was for the ruling clique a question of life and death. The program, principles, ties with the masses, everything was rooted out and cast aside because of the anxiety of the new ruling clique for its self-preservation. These people stop at nothing in order to guard their privileges and power. Recently, an announcement was released to the whole world to the effect that my youngest son, Sergei Sadov, was under indictment for plotting mass poisoning of the workers. Every normal person will conclude, people capable of preferring such a charge have reached the last degree of moral degradation. Is it possible in that case to doubt even for a moment that these same accusers are capable of fostering the anti-Semitic prejudices of the masses? Precisely in the case of my son, both these depravities are united. It is worthwhile to consider this case. From the day of their birth, my sons bore the name of their mother, Sadov. They never used any other name, neither at elementary school, nor at the university, nor in their later life. As for me, during the past 35 years, I had borne the name of Trotsky. During the Soviet period, no one ever called me by the name of my father, Bronstein, just as no one ever called Stalin Zhugashvili. In order not to oblige my sons to change their name, I, for, quote, citizenship, end quote, requirements, took on the name of my wife, which according to Soviet law is fully permissible, end parenthesis. However, after my son, Sergei Sadov, was charged with the utterly incredible accusation of plotting to poison workers, the GPU announced in the Soviet and foreign press the, quote, real, end quote, exclamation point, end parenthesis, name of my son is not Sadov, but Bronstein. If these falsifiers wished to emphasize the connection of the accused with me, they would have called him Trotsky, since politically the name Bronstein means nothing at all to anyone. But they were out for another game. That is, they wished to emphasize my Jewish origin and the semi-Jewish origin of my son. I paused at this episode because it has a vital and not yet at all exceptional character. The whole struggle against the opposition is full of such episodes. Between 1923 and 1926, when Stalin, with Zinoviev and Kamenev, was still a member of the, quote, Troika, end quote, the play on the strings of anti-Semitism bore a very cautious and masked character. Especially schooled orators, parenthesis, Stalin already then led an underhanded struggle against his associates, end parenthesis, said that followers of Trotsky are petty bourgeois from, quote, small towns, end quote, without defining their race. Actually, that was untrue. The percentage of Jewish intellectuals in the opposition was in no case any greater than that in the party and in the bureaucracy. It is sufficient to name the leaders of the opposition for the years 1923 to 25. Ian Smirnov, Serebryakov, Rakovsky, Pyatakov, Preobrazhensky, Krestinsky, Muralov, Beloborodov, Mrachkovsky, V. Yakovlev, Sopranov, V.M. Smirnov, Ishtchenko, fully indigenous Russians. Radek at the time was only half sympathetic, but as in the trials of the grafters and other scoundrels, so at the time of the expulsion of the opposition from the party, the bureaucracy purposely emphasized the names of Jewish members of casual and secondary importance. This was quite openly discussed in the party, and back in 1925, the opposition saw in this situation the unmistakable symptom of the decay of the ruling clique. After Zinoviev and Kamenev joined the opposition, the situation changed radically for the worse. At this point, there opened wide a perfect chance to say to the worker that the head of the opposition stand three, quote, dissatisfied Jewish intellectuals, end quote. Under the direction of Stalin, Uganov in Moscow and Kirov in Leningrad carried through this line systematically and almost fully in the open, in order the more sharply to demonstrate to the workers the differences between the, quote, old course and the, quote, new. The Jews, even more unreservedly devoted to the general line, were removed from responsible party and Soviet posts. Not only in the country, but even in the Moscow factories, the baiting of the opposition back in 1926 often assumed a thoroughly obvious anti-Semitic character. Many agitators spoke brazenly, quote, the Jews are rioting, end quote. I received hundreds of letters deploring the anti-Semitic methods in the struggle with the opposition. At one of the sessions of the Politburo, I wrote Bukharin a note, quote, you cannot help knowing that even in Moscow, in the struggle with the opposition, methods of Black Hundred demagogues, parenthesis, anti-Semitism, etc., in parenthesis, are utilized, end quote. Bukharin answered me evasively on that same piece of paper, quote, individual instances, of course, are possible, end quote. I want to repeat that line. Quote, individual instances, of course, are possible, end quote. Bukharin. I again wrote, quote, I have in mind not individual instances, but a systematic agitation among the party secretaries at large Moscow enterprises. Will you agree to come with me to investigate an example of this at the factory Skorokhod? Parenthesis, I know a number of other such examples, in parenthesis, end quote. Bukharin answered, quote, all right, we can go, end quote. In vain I tried to make Bukharin carry out the promise. Stalin most categorically forbade Bukharin to do so. In the months of preparation for the expulsions of the opposition from the party, the arrests, the exiles, parenthesis, in the second half of 1927, in parenthesis, the anti-Semitic agitation assumed a thoroughly unbridled character. The slogan, beat the opposition, often took on the complexion of the old slogan, beat the Jews and save Russia. Quote, beat the Jews and save Russia. The matter went so far that Stalin was constrained to come out with a printed statement which declared, quote, we fight against Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev not because they are Jews, but because they are oppositionists, end quote, etc. To every politically thinking person it was completely clear that this consciously equivocal declaration directed against, quote, excesses, end quote, of anti-Semitism did at the same time, with complete premeditation, nourish it. Quote, do not forget that the leaders of the opposition are Jews, end quote. That was the meaning of the statement of Stalin, published in all Soviet journals. When the opposition, to meet the repressions, proceeded with a more decisive and open struggle, Stalin, in the form of a very significant, quote, jest, told Pyatakov and Preobrazhensky, quote, you at the least are fighting against the CE, openly brandishing your axes. That proves your, quote, orthodox action. Trotsky works slyly and not with a hatchet, end quote. Preobrazhensky and Pyatakov related this conversation to me with strong revulsion. Dozens of times Stalin attempted to counterpose the, quote, orthodox core of the opposition to me. The well-known German radical journalist, the former editor of Die Action, Franz Pfemfert, I have a piece by Franz Pfemfert, he was associated with Council Communism in Germany, at present in exile, wrote me in August 1936, quote, perhaps you remember that several years ago in Action, I declared that many actions of Stalin can be explained by his anti-Semitic tendencies. The fact that in this monstrous trial he, through TASS, managed to, quote, correct the names of Zinoviev and Kamenev represents by itself a gesture in typical Streicher style. In this manner, Stalin gave the go, quote, go sign to all anti-Semitic, unscrupulous elements, end quote. In fact, the names Zinoviev and Kamenev, it would seem, are more famous than the names of Radomyslitsky and Rosenfeld. What other motives could Stalin have had to make known the, quote, real names of his victims, except to play with anti-Semitic moods? Such an act, and without the slightest legal justification, was, as we have seen, likewise committed over the name of my son. But undoubtedly, the most astonishing thing is the fact that all four, quote, terrorists, end quote, allegedly sent by me from abroad turned out to be Jews and at the same time agents of the anti-Semitic Gestapo, exclamation point. Inasmuch as I have ever actually seen any of these unfortunates, it is clear that the GPU deliberately selected them because of their racial origin, and the GPU does not function by virtue of its own inspiration. Let me copy this down. Sorry, I know this is taking forever and it's annoying to listen to the silence. That's why I'm humming along. Again, if such methods are practiced at the top, where the personal responsibility of Stalin is absolutely unquestionable, then it's not hard to imagine what transpires at the factories and especially at the coal causes. And how can it be otherwise? The physical extermination of the older generations of the Bolsheviks is for every person who can think an incontrovertible expression of the Thermidorian reaction. And in its most advanced stage, that history has never yet seen an example when the reaction following the revolutionary upsurge was not accompanied by the most unbridled chauvinistic passions, anti-Semitism among them. In the opinion of some, quote, friends of the USSR, my reference to the exploitation of anti-Semitic tendencies by a considerable part of the present bureaucracy represents a malicious invention for the purpose of a struggle against Stalin. It is difficult to argue with professional, quote, friends of the bureaucracy. These people deny the existence of a Thermidorian reaction. They accept even the Moscow trials at face value. They're not, quote, friends who visit the USSR with special intention of seeing spots on the sun. Not a few of these receive special pay for their readiness to see only what is pointed out to them by the finger of the bureaucracy. Below to those workers, revolutionists, socialists, Democrats, who, in the words of Pushkin, prefer, quote, a delusion which exalts us, end quote, to the bitter truth. One must face life as it is. It is necessary to find in reality itself the force to overcome its reactionary and barbaric features. That is what Marxism teaches us. Some would-be, quote, pundits have accused me of, quote, suddenly raising the, quote, Jewish question, and of intending to create some kind of ghetto for the Jews. I can only shrug my shoulders in pity. I've lived my whole life outside of Jewish circles. I've always worked in the Russian workers' movement. My native tongue is Russian. Unfortunately, I have not even learned to read Jewish. The Jewish question has never occupied the center of my attention. But that does not mean that I have the right to be blind to the Jewish problem which exists and demands solution. Quote, the friends of the USSR are satisfied with the creation of Birobidyan. I think that was like the like a Jewish community that was created in like the Asian part of Russia. I will not stop at this point to consider whether it was built on a sound foundation and what type of regime exists there. Parenthesis, Birobidyan cannot help reflecting all the vices of bureaucratic despotism, in parenthesis. But not a single progressive thinking individual will object to the USSR designating a special territory for those of its citizens who feel themselves to be Jews, who use the Jewish language in preference to all others, and who wish to live as a compact mass. Is this or is this not a ghetto? During the period of Soviet democracy, of completely voluntary migrations, there could be no talk about ghettos, but the Jewish question, by the very manner in which settlements of Jews occurred, assumes an international aspect. Are we not correct in saying that a World Socialist Federation would have to make possible the creation of a, quote, Birobidyan, quote, for those Jews who wish to have their own autonomous republic as the arena for their own culture? It may be presumed that a socialist democracy will not resort to compulsory assimilation. It may very well be that within 2 or 3 generations the boundaries of an independent Jewish republic, as of many other national regions, will be erased. I have neither time nor desire to meditate on this. Our descendants will know better than we what to do. I have in mind a transitional historic period when the Jewish question as such is still acute and demands adequate measures from a world federation of worker states. The very same methods of solving the Jewish question, which under decaying capitalism have a utopian and reactionary character, parenthesis, Zionism, in parenthesis, will, under the regime of socialist federation, take on a real and salutary meaning. That is what I wanted to point out. How could any Marxist or even any consistent Democrat object to this? The end. Thanks for listening.